there's hours long lectures on YouTube, such as the ones that you provide, that you can choose to engage with, or an equivalent amount of time in YouTube Shorts. It's part of the same platform, part of the same product, depending on what your intention is when you use it. And that's an important thing. Has your intention with your off-grid living, an absence of computers in telecommunication devices, what has been your primary intention with that? Is it to unplug from the internet, or is it more like does it carry with it more like the Amish intent?
Great question. I wouldn't say it carries the Amish intent in this, in the sense of like, I don't believe, for example, that it's necessarily, they believe, for example, that old technology of that sort is sinful, right? Whereas I believe it can be a tool that can be used in many positive ways, many even Christ-centered ways in some ways, from if you look at it from a Christian perspective. But in my case, it's more it's borderline romanticism of a time that I believed was and I don't want to be called nostalgic, because I'm not one of the people who say that everything in the past was great. It wasn't. In fact, arguably, there are many things that are better today, I would say also. So it's not as clear cut. But in this particular framework, I do think the past was much better in the sense of that we had a high point where you had the sufficient technology to do many of the things we still do, but you could still disconnect in many ways. You might not have had YouTube, right? But you still had, you had back in those days, I remember the days of, you used to be able to buy VHS courses, like tutorials on algebra. They even had algebra. And I remember watching those, you had a VCR. I go back that far, but so it wasn't as instant as YouTube. You had to actually pay for you could rent them though, but you still had to pay some money. But I regard YouTube, I agree with you. I think YouTube is the modern equivalent of the public square. It's vast, it's noisy, it's often chaotic, but if you watch the corners, there's still genuine learning where it can still occur. And it has made access to education easier in some ways, but the problem is that it has also flooded the field. You have gimmickry, theatrics, and what I call pedagogy by popularity. There are great minds out there sharing content, but they have to compete. You have entertainers masquerading as instructors. It's sort of the tragedy of the medium. It holds the Library of Alexandria, and yet the crowd, gathers around the puppet show. If that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. That's a really good analogy. Yeah. So what do you think then would the future of education look like, given the great strengths of YouTube, but also the downsides of it? And additionally, I'm curious. We have the emerging field of AI, and I've heard a few of the things that you have to say about AI. But I'm very curious if AI plays a role in the future of education, in this in any facet that YouTube has as well.
I use, despite all the things I say, I use YouTube because I believe that if you're going to enter, and you must these days enter the agora, you may as well bring a scroll and speak plainly. There will always be people, I think, who value that and will be drawn to you. They might be drawn, the majority might be drawn to the circus entertainer, that's for sure. But that's always been, right? There's always been an element of that. That's why I'm not as nostalgic as people think, because I think if you go back to, I remember school in the 80s, for example, elementary school, and if you talk to the average person about math, they would have the same reaction that people have today. Most people would either tell you that they failed it, or would say they're not interested, or they would straight up call you, a nerd or something, right? It was okay. We back then, we were actually a lot meaner in our interactions than people are today. I think people, nowadays there's a lot more an emphasis on not making people feel bad, right? So, but that said, I think with AI, yes, despite the things I say, it is a tool. It is there, already there. Like, it's not going to disappear. Does it have staggering potential? Yes, but it also has the equally staggering risk. And at its best, in my view, it can make collecting and organizing information very easy in a way that can make sense. But I think it will erode the professor-student relationship. It will, because what I fear is it's going to flatten knowledge into mere data points, and it's going to tempt us to confuse automation with knowledge. Now, some people might like that, and from a business perspective, that might be legit. I'm all for freedom, right? I believe in the freedom of businesses, but I also think AI cannot replace the moral judgment of a professor or a teacher. It's never going to give you the nuance of a lived philosophy, or, the delight of a well-crafted explanation. It may generate it, and it often does generate correct answers, but it cannot inspire, the kind of awe that leads a student to pursue truth for its own sake. And, I kind of see it, YouTube and AI, sort of like the chalk and slate. They are instruments. And what matters is, once again, going back to, is the hand that holds them and the mind behind that hand. So if we keep virtue, rigor, and purpose at the center of education, then yes, these tools perhaps can serve as well. But I fear, and what I think is going to happen is we're going to surrender to novelty. And we're going to risk creating students who are informed at best, but they're never actually formed. And we're already seeing that in many ways, because I've had students who tell me, you know what, professor, I can just plug in your equation into ChatGPT. Yeah, I know that. They tell me as if I didn't know. I also know that you could have done it way before ChatGPT. You could have done it on Wolfram. But the point is, right, is to demonstrate your the joy that comes from being a student is not that you can plug into the computer. Yeah, I know you can do that. I can also look something up on Google, right? That doesn't, but it takes away the mystery, the joy. Now, arguably, there are some people who will tell you, well, students have never felt joy in learning, and that is true. A lot of, but I would say not every student, right? A lot of students have never found joy. You could go back to, for example, Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, early 1800s. There are reports about students rioting, throwing rocks at the windows of math professors. I mean, it's all there. But what I think is different is that sense of mystery, right? Because I don't know if you've ever felt when you actually understand something and it makes sense, you get a sense of joy. So what would be the purpose of education if, yes, if you can ask the machine anything you want, then we may as well just pack it up, because there is no joy, there's no work added. And I think as human beings, we need that. We need that confirmation that our work means something.